this evening's speaker, who really doesn't need much of an introduction. Monsieur Timothy Verdon has been a fixture in the city for over 50 years, originally from New Jersey, an art historian who came and has made his life here in Florence, and along the way became a Catholic priest and has a senior position in the hierarchy at the Duomo. And his day job, if that wasn't enough, is he's the director of the Museo della Opera del Duomo. And he also teaches at Stanford on the study abroad program. So Timothy is one of the great individuals of our city, and it's a great privilege to welcome him back to the Institute to tell us all about the baptistry. Thank you, Timothy.
You can hear me, yes? Simon, to whom my thanks for the invitation, asked me to speak about the Florence Baptistry this evening, and I do so with pleasure. You know that the monumental buildings there in Piazza del Duomo, the baptistry and the cathedral, form a single ecclesiastical unit. And so I'm a canon of the cathedral, but also of the baptistry. And therefore, tonight I'm playing with the home team, as it were, talking about things that are of everyday familiarity to us. And I've studied and published on the baptistry, and it's a pleasure to share a few of the ideas that I and others have developed about it with you. The baptistry, as you know, is the oldest of the great Florentine monuments, begun probably in the mid-11th century. And it really is the first of the big and richly decorated buildings, and therefore set what we might call the benchmark for quality in architecture and art, and also for what I'll try to illustrate as a level of meaning, both religious and existential, that would become mandatory in Florence. Florentines want not only fine art, but deeply meaningful art as well. And all of that starts with the baptistry. It is octagonal in shape, revetted in white and green marble. There's great discussion about the earlier stages of development of the building, but we think that in its present form, it replaces a much smaller early Christian baptistry that stood on this site. It was built around the foundations of the early Christian baptistry. And when it was being built, there was very little of the white and green marble decoration on the exterior. You would have seen a great deal of the local sandstone, but gradually, one generation after another added ever more marble revetment, giving it not only the gem-like richness that it still has. This is an old photograph when it was still dirty. Today we see it as it was cleaned a few years ago, and it really gleams in the sunlight. The building assumed this pristine form and rich exterior decoration between the 11th and the 13th century. The last phases of its decoration on the exterior are perhaps due to the same Arnolfo di Cambio, who in 1296 began work on the cathedral. And so it's a building long in taking shape that then really set the standard for much that followed it. In Florentine tradition, the baptistry is thought to originally have been a pagan temple. Medieval legend recounted by Giovanni Villani in his 14th century Chronicle of Florence, but he refers to this as information passed on down the generations, imagined that on this same site there had stood an improbably octagonal temple to the god Mars. Here is a detail from a painting by Vasari in Palazzo Vecchio that imagines what the founding of Roman Florence might have been. And according to the legend, among the first things that the founders did was to send emissaries to Rome to ask the Roman Senate to send the same architect who had built the Pantheon to create a great temple in Florence. And all of that happened, taking the form that Vasari imagines here. It's interesting, this painting, because he very improbably combines the medieval striped corner pilasters with the real classical columns that we see in the interior of the baptistry, creating a kind of building that certainly never existed in antiquity, or as far as we know, in any other period. He shows a statue of the divinity venerated in this building, Mars, on a high column at the center. And we know that in the Middle Ages, Florence still saw the ruins of a statue of the god Mars that were finally a ruined statue that was finally swept away in a flood in the 14th century. So Vasari has put together elements of legend and historical fact to create basically a fake, but a fascinating one that helps us enter the way in which Florentines have seen this building as a link with their own historical past, a building that has stood there since the foundation of Florence in the first century before Christ, and is still there as a Christian church now. Part of the legend is that during the barbarian invasions of Florence, and here an illumination from a 14th century manuscript, during the barbarian invasions, when the rest of the city was destroyed and its citizens killed, and there you see the red-bearded barbarian king giving orders to behead those poor people, a bishop who's lost his head there, and others at your right. The walls of the city have been demolished. The only building really standing is the baptistry there at the center. And part of the legend then is that it has remained standing from antiquity to the present. And when the city was rebuilt, and here's the successive image in that manuscript showing the surviving Florentines rebuilding their city, rebuilding the walls, the artist shows the walls being built around the baptistry. So it is in his mind the center of the city that was rebuilt from its own ruins after the barbarian invasions of the 6th and 7th centuries. And the shape of the city reflects the octagonal shape of the baptistry. When the 14th century artist did the miniature, the city had begun to take the shape that we know. Here's the old historic center within the third set of walls. And so the outermost walls, corresponding to the viale today in Florence, are not quite octagonal in shape, but they do have an irregular polygonal shape. And so the artist, in showing them rise around the baptistry as if there were an emanation of the baptistry, in a sense is saying the whole city, as it rose after the tragedy of the barbarian invasions, rose as a response to the mystery in the full Christian sense of the baptistry. The octagon in Christian symbolism alludes to a time outside our time. Our time is measured in the 7 days of the week, but there is, the fathers of the church said, an 8th day, octava dies, and the octagonal shape of early Christian baptistries and of our baptistry alludes to baptism as the entry into that eternal dimension, into the 8th day of eternity. But those are allusions and symbolic references to which we'll return presently. In actual fact, the baptistry was, as I said, the first monumental structure that Florence erected. It was finished and in full use long before the new cathedral was ready. No other church or public building in the city had a comparable level of costly and handsome external decoration. Here you see a detail from an early 15th century cassone, a marriage dowry chest, which shows the baptistry, but the baptistry as the venue of a pretty nice party there, a great celebration. You see people on foot and mounted on fine horses. You see a great many banners. They are the pali, the ceremonial banners often made of the standards of defeated enemies that were carried in procession in the city, and then in the 14th and 15th centuries were donated to the baptistry and hung in the baptistry. It was a kind of trophy hall of the signs of Florentine military victories. Here, all of that is somehow communicated in this marvelous scene of festivity. And so the symbolic meanings and the historical function of the building as the central focus of public ceremonial in Florence before the cathedral itself was available are really part of our story. Here we're looking at the south door of the baptistry. And the group of statuary above the door is the group whose fragments we still have in the Opera del Duomo Museum, Tino di Camaina's Handsome Baptism of Christ. So it's a fairly accurate image. You see that in the background, there's a large building, which if this is the south side, the side that you see coming from Via Calzaioli, where that building stands, today we have the opening of Via Martelli leading to Via Cavour. And so you say, what is that building? Let me show you a reconstruction drawing of what it all looked like before the new cathedral was built. In this drawing, the artist has imagined the baptistry with its decoration not yet complete. The striped corners of the octagon are not in place. The whole upper attic area has not been decorated. You see very close to the front of the baptistry, the porch of the old cathedral, Santa Reparata. It was indeed much closer to the baptistry than the facade of the new cathedral would be. And in the space between the baptistry and the old cathedral, Santa Reparata, you have a series of Roman sarcophagi. We have two of them in the museum, another two are in the baptistry itself. But once this whole public space was filled with these sarcophagi left from the ancient Roman city of Florence and reused by Christians in the Middle Ages. And there again, right in front of us, where you should see the opening into Via Martelli, you have that building. It was a hospital. It was the hospital of St. John the Evangelist. And it would be demolished at the beginning of work on the new cathedral, because that space was clearly needed for the construction machinery and materiel for the building of the new church. As I said, the facade of the new cathedral would be pulled much farther back from the baptistry. A document of the period makes the point that they had to pull the facade of the cathedral back because on important occasions when the bishop spoke to the people in the piazza, there wasn't enough room. And so they wanted to create a much larger square between baptistry and cathedral. And what we see today is their idea of large. There is a painting of the 1340s in the Loggia del Bigallo, of which here I show you a detail. It's a painting by Bernardo Daddi, or an artist close to him. It's a splendid figure of Mary as Mother of Mercy, but beneath her feet, there is an amazing 14th century cityscape, a view of Florence, in which, in our detail, you very clearly see the baptistry, a bit to your left of center, and then more toward your right, in front of the baptistry, you see the rising walls of the new cathedral. You see the white marble facade built to about a third of its height. You see the bell tower built to about a third of its height. And behind the white marble facade of the cathedral, you see the roof of the old cathedral, which in fact remained standing until about 1379 or 80. They built the new one around the old. But it's an amazing view of Florence in the 1340s, in which the baptistry clearly emerges as still the dominant monument. Indeed, even the Renaissance would see the baptistry as an extremely important part of Florentine history. Here in a handsome painting now in Baltimore in the United States in the Walters Art Gallery, attributed to Luciano Laurana from Urbino, you see an ideal city view with handsome Renaissance palazzi at right and left. But then, as was true in so many Italian cities, with an ancient monument still visible, there it's the Colosseum, my goodness, and also a triumphal arch at the center. But then to your right of center, you see a building that clearly wants to evoke the Florentine baptistry. It dresses it up a bit in modern finery. It improves the medieval geometries of the exterior decoration, giving them a much more Renaissance look. And yet the building must represent the Florence Baptistry and really helps us understand that admiration for this building remained constant even in an age like the Renaissance that had begun to look strongly forward in its architecture, in its concept of what a city should be. The medieval baptistry still remained important, in part because they believed that it had been an ancient building, and therefore they saw it as one of the possible paths open to the Renaissance in its effort to revive classical antiquity. Here, a 16th century engraving in a book that deals with Florentine monuments shows you what the artist imagined could have been the ancient Roman appearance of the baptistry. They gradually realized that this legend that it had been a Roman building was invented. It was what today historians call a foundation myth of Florence. It didn't correspond to truth. The ancient Romans really did not build structures in this style. Florentines like to think it was an ancient building because it put them in direct touch with their entire history in a single building. But the Renaissance illustration of what it might have looked like in antiquity is a key to that ambition to find in a single important structure all of Florentine history represented. In fact, the baptistry as we see it, as I said, was built in the mid-11th century. The date often associated with its beginning is 1059. It was built over and around a small early Christian baptistry, and it was built on the land between the early Christian baptistry and the old cathedral, Santa Reparata, which had become a cemetery. Here is a photograph taken during excavations done in the 1970s from the upper facade of the cathedral, which shows you the paving of the piazza removed and a series of late antique and medieval tombs below the pavement of Piazza del Duomo. We knew that there was a cemetery there because there are archival documents in which the city officially asks families who have deceased loved ones buried in that cemetery to remove the bodies, because this is going to become a piazza, will no longer be an open-air cemetery. Most of them did, but the forms of the tombs remained. That fact is important to understand the decoration of the baptistry. At the very center of the building, there no longer stands, but there stood from the time of Arnolfo or even earlier, an octagonal baptismal font. There you see a reconstruction of it made in the 1920s. It's no longer in the baptistry. We have the fragments of it in the museum. It would have looked something like this. There would have been the square font in the center, and then around it, a wall, and those bringing children for baptism would enter through one of the four gates and bring the child to the font at the center. That octagonal wall around the font exactly defines what archaeological excavation has shown to be the foundations of the original early Christian baptistry. And so it's very interesting from the point of view of collective memory that in building the new and much larger baptistry, they nonetheless went out of their way to carefully preserve the space of the original baptismal building, which is defined, as I say, by that octagonal wall. The octagon, as I've already said, was a symbol of eternal life. With baptism, Christians believe the gate to eternal life is open to them. And it's very significant then that in the magnificent mosaic decoration of the dome, which crowns the baptistry, the dome itself built or finished, I should say, by the mid-12th century, one of the marvels of medieval engineering and architecture, a dome with a diameter of 26 meters, the biggest after that of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. In the mosaics of the dome, though, Bible stories are told around an enormous central figure. You see him even in the general view. Here you have a detail. It is a figure of the dead and risen Christ. You can see the wounds of the nails in his hands and feet. You see that he holds his body in the pose he assumed on the cross, but you also see that he is fully alive, that he wears glorious vesture. And so it is the Christ who died, who rose, who ascended to heaven. He's seated on a kind of rainbow. There are 7 rings to it. He's seated above the 7th ring. Those are the 7 heavens. He is seated in the empyrean, between the above the 7 heavens. And he's coming again at the end of time to judge the living and the dead. If you look at his very large and frankly rather ugly right foot, it overlays that symbolic circle which defines his eternal space, because he's emerging from eternity to come again. And beneath his feet, we see a series of tombs, sarcophagi, from which people are rising. Remember, there was a cemetery around the building until the beginning of the construction of the cathedral. When these mosaics are made, the cemetery is still there. So people who in baptism believed they had gained access to eternity, and who, when they physically died, might be buried in the cemetery right outside the baptistry, their family members entering saw above the font, where people had been baptized into both the death and the resurrection of Christ, that's the theology, they saw Christ who had died, who rose, and who at the end of time comes to call the dead from their tombs. That's the expectation. The building symbolizes the Christian hope to be summoned to share eternity with Christ. But there's a difference. If you look at Christ's 2 hands, you see that the hand at your left, which is his right hand, is open, whereas the hand at your right, which is his left hand, is somewhat clumsily turned in token of refusal. Those who rise from their tombs beneath his open and welcoming right hand are assisted by magnificently attired angels, and they rise with joy. They're going to heaven. Those on the other side who rise beneath his hand that turns them away are assisted by bat-winged angels. We call them devils. And they are obviously rather reluctant, as if to say, it really wasn't so bad in the tomb. Couldn't we say a bit longer? Because they will be ushered into a very technicolor image of hell immediately to the viewer's right of all of this. I didn't bring it this evening. It is, though, an amazing iconographical program dealing with life and death, eternal life, and the death of hell, which is also eternal. All of that, though, is certainly part of the meaning of the building that today is often forgotten. This evening, I indicate it in a very brief way, simply to bring you into the picture. The mosaics were completed by the early 1300s. The very last bits of glass are being put in at that time. And then, lo and behold, the people who had built the baptistry, Florence had the brilliant custom of assigning the construction and decoration of important buildings to wealthy guilds. And so in this case, the Merchants Guild, the Arte di Calimala, they thought they'd done a superb job. It was all finished. And then they saw rising in front of the baptistry the facade of the new cathedral, richly decorated. Here's a 16th century drawing that shows what the medieval decoration of the facade of the cathedral looked like. You know that we've reconstructed it in our museum. And understandably, being Florentines, they said, well, maybe we should do some sculpture for the baptistry too. They wanted to compete with what was being done at the cathedral. And so that statuary group by Tino and other statuary groups were made. The baptistry acquires fine works of sculpture. Here are fragments of Tino di Camaina's Baptism of Christ group, now in the museum. The baptistry acquired its first sculpture as a response to what was being done on the cathedral facade. After some marble sculpture was done above the doors, they moved to bronze and did the extraordinary first set of bronze doors by Andrea Pisano. Here's a detail showing the decapitation of John the Baptist. You know, we have the doors now in the museum, cleaned, finely illuminated. There they are in their case. There are two visitors from America, one a former student of mine with whom we saw these things an hour ago. And so I can assure you they're still there. No one has walked off with the doors. The scene of the beheading of John the Baptist by Andrea Pisano picks up the narrative theme already developed in the mosaics. Here's a detail from those earlier mosaics. And that's, in a sense, the story, not only of the decoration of the baptistry, but of some of the main masterpieces in the history of Florentine art. They are generated by the enormous interest in this extremely important church, the church of the city's patron saint, John the Baptist. It creates first the mosaics, then Andrea Pisano's bronze doors, then Ghiberti's sets of bronze doors, which don't have anything to do with John the Baptist, but it also has the silver altar at the end of the 15th century. Andrea del Verrocchio, perhaps with the help of young Leonardo, who was then still in his shop, we're in the 1470s, does this silver relief showing the decapitation of John the Baptist. It is made for the rich altar frontal that had been begun in the 1360s and was brought to completion at the end of the 15th century. These works are now in the museum, as is the extraordinary set of vestments made for the baptistry, made for the feast of St. John the Baptist, with the scenes from the life of John the Baptist, drawn by Antonio Pollaiuolo and embroidered in a period of 20 years by a team of expert embroiderers from Flanders, Germany, Spain. We have the embroidered panels, which we exhibit in the museum on cutout forms, suggesting how they would have sat on the liturgical vestments where they appeared. These are masterpieces. People who study textile history consider this the Sistine Chapel. And here's one of the scenes. You can make out, even in their worn form, the wool and silk colored threads, but also the gold and silver thread, and it was the weight of the gold and silver threads in these embroideries. Here's another one that ultimately destroyed the actual fabric of the vestments. The embroideries were too heavy, and so after several centuries, by the 18th century, the vestments were in shreds, and they decided simply to cut the embroideries out and let people see them as autonomous works of art. We have them in the museum now. It's important to remember that they really are part of the story of the life of John the Baptist. What I'm doing, though, is showing you a series of masterpieces generated for the baptistry by the Florentine veneration for the city's patron saint, John the Baptist, in this magnificent temple created in his honor there at the center of the city. In the 16th century, at the beginning of the century, a grand statuary group is made to stand above the main door. It is made by Andrea Sansovino. His are the two statues at your right, Christ and John the Baptist. The rather clumsy-looking angel at your left is done in the 18th century simply for the sake of symmetry. But they really could have done better than that. The 18th century has many faults, but this is one of the graver ones. Later in the first half of the 16th century, Giovan Francesco Rustici does the three bronze statues that stood for centuries above the north door. Now they're in the museum, showing the preaching of John the Baptist and two listeners who have various levels of distrust and doubt and criticism. Vasari says that Rustici, the sculptor, was helped in designing this group by Leonardo da Vinci. And indeed, the figure especially at your right, that bald Pharisee or scribe as he is very similar to figures we see in Leonardo's drawings. For the big Leonardo exhibit at the Louvre a few years ago, the director of the Louvre, Jean-Luc Martinez, wrote asking if they could borrow this group of statues. And I had to write back and say, they're in such a difficult position in the museum that to remove them from their place above the bronze doors, I'd have to close the whole museum for 2 weeks and bring in cranes and so on, and then repeat that when they came back. So even though your exhibit is going to be magnificent, you don't have a budget that allows you to give us a full month of missing revenues. And he accepted that, and he hadn't seen the museum, so he came to Florence, and we had a view of the museum together. Then on the south door in the 1560s, Vincenzo Danti, an artist from Perugia, who however worked in Florence, did the third group. It is the decapitation of John the Baptist, again with Salome looking rather affectedly shocked. I mean, she is the one who asked for his head to be cut off, so I don't quite see why she's so upset by this, but maybe she hadn't really thought the thing through to the end. At all events, these two are now in the museum. And in the museum, we also have the handsome marble group created in the 1720s by the Florentine Baroque sculptor Girolamo Ticciati. We show it, the figure of John the Baptist lifted by angels to heaven, other angels holding candlesticks, and then below him an altar with the eagles that were the logo of the Arte di Calimala, the Merchants Guild that was still paying for everything here, and the handsome relief below the altar. We simply show these works and evoke their position in the baptistry. Before they were removed in 1911, though, a photograph was made that shows us how they looked between 1722 or so and 1911. And you see that they were much more Baroque than our museum installation really lets on, because behind the figure of John the Baptist, there above the altar in the baptistry, there was the kind of very theatrical glory done in wood and stucco, gilded rays, clouds, John the Baptist being lifted toward that medieval Mosaic figure of Christ above. It was a very effective Baroque machine. That's the term used in Italian for these elaborate theatrical compositions, macchina barocca. And to give you an idea of the actual quality, let me show you one of the reliefs there on the altar rail. It shows John the Baptist preaching in front of King Herod. It's extremely elegant Florentine Baroque sculpture. It was in its own way a masterpiece, but the early 20th century felt that this kind of Baroque art in the medieval baptistry was inappropriate, and so they removed it, happily for us, because we're able to put it in the museum. There's one of the eagles. There are at least 20 of these eagles. Everyone would have recognized that the eagle with the bale of wool in its talons was the symbol of this ancient Florentine guild. So when people talk about modern and especially American advertising, I would say, look at how many logos of the Merchants Guild we had in the baptistry. They understood advertising quite well. The baptistry, as we see it, stands in a very wide open space, but originally the space around it was more constricted. Here is an aerial view of Piazza del Duomo with the baptistry at the center, done in the 1580s. It's a detail of the aerial view of the city by Stefano Bonsignori. And you can see that right behind the baptistry, below it in the slide, there's a building that's extremely close to the baptistry, and that isn't there anymore because that building was removed in the late 19th century, creating the very large open space behind the baptistry that we see today. That building was the original Archbishop's Palace, and the building that today is the Archbishop's Palace, which in the slide is the building below it, was the diocesan office building, as we might call it. Here is a photograph made just before they demolished that original Archbishop's Palace. You can see the scaffolding is already going up for the work of demolition, but it's clear how terribly close it was to the back of the baptistry. And so the baptistry emerged with far greater force when the space around it was so compressed. This explosion of white and green marble in these perfect geometric forms made a profound impact in the much more limited original space of the piazza than it does today. Then the late 19th century that wanted to make Florence look like Paris or Vienna, and therefore destroyed many medieval buildings in order to create large open spaces, did its dirty work in Piazza del Duomo. Also, there you see the Archbishop's Palace, the first form of it, going down, the scaffolding around it. Here is a photograph made from the demolition. As they demolished it, they realized that it was not, as it appeared, the late Renaissance building that they thought. It had been given a late Renaissance facade in the late 16th century, but actually the nucleus of the building, the core of the building, was medieval. But when they discovered that they were destroying one of Florence's earliest large public buildings, it was already too late. You couldn't go back. And so they went on with their insane project. At all events, here we are inside the baptistry, where you have some sense of the overall beauty. You won't see this view again for several years because we're now putting up scaffolding to begin the restoration of the mosaics. We've restored the side walls. They will still be visible, but the entire mosaic-clad dome will soon be invisible. And our slide, therefore, will help remind you of how splendid it all is. Below it, you see the rich interior marble revetment. You see the ancient classical columns, probably cannibalized from the remains of some Roman temple, still, at least in ruins in Florence, when they built the baptistry in the 11th and 12th centuries. You do see a building that, if it wasn't actually an ancient temple, nonetheless conserves the richness and texture and detail of Florentine history better than any other structure in the city. Let me close with this fine, if somewhat spotty, view of the octagonal dome, of the lantern, of the ball and cross above it. Long before Brunelleschi built his dome, this was the symbol of Florentine hope for eternity, of Florentine genius in engineering, of the Florentine decision to give back to God in the form of these costly marble revetments, and inside the still more costly mosaics, some of the enormous wealth that they felt only God's blessing had made it possible for them to acquire. It is an amazing building. And when Dante, who wrote his comedy when the mosaics were still mint new, calls the baptistry Il mio bel San Giovanni, my beautiful church of St. John the Baptist, we understand him. It is beautiful, and those who live here do come to feel that in some sense it is at the heart of their own experience of this amazing city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timothy. If I may just unshare the screen so that we can welcome the Zoomers aboard. Yeah, that's Zoomers. And we'll enable the chat so we can see what they're saying. Okay, so as is our common practice, we will now have a question and answer session. And the rules are the same as always. If you're in the room and you want to make a question or a comment, put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone. You must use the microphone so not only can we hear in the room, but also crucially the Zoomers can hear what you're saying. And if you're on the Zoom and would like to talk to us, there's two ways of doing it. You can put something in the comments and I'll read it out, or you can wave at me and unmute yourself and speak to us, or you can be bold and just unmute yourself and speak and we'll hear you. We'll break precedent and see if anyone on the Zoom would like to go first. Do we have a bold Zoomer who wants to start the conversation? We'll let you think about it a bit longer and see if there's anything in the room. Anyone in the room? We've got one at the back. Let me just bring you the microphone.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned that they're going to be doing a restoration of the inside of, and how long did you say that will probably?
Well, I didn't say because
okay. We don't
as
know.
usually happens, we don't really know. They're thinking in terms of max 5 years.
Wow.
I mean, this is more than 2,000 square meters of mosaic, which has to be cleaned millimeter by millimeter. So even though there'll be a team of people doing this, it really requires very close attention over an extended period of time. One doesn't know when one starts these projects what kinds of problems may arise. And so the estimate of time is extremely flexible.
I have a follow-up. So rumor had it, I read somewhere that like Brancacci, there will be scaffolding.
Yes.
That people will be allowed.
Yes.
To go up and see during.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very exciting. Yeah.
Yes, the opera wants to make it an occasion for citizens and visitors to really look up close at these marvelous works and also understand something of the cleaning process.
Which builds neatly into the first question from the Zoom in the chat, where Robert Malco has asked, can you briefly discuss the planning and execution of the mosaics? Briefly?
Well, mosaics are pictures. At least these medieval mosaics are all figurative, narrative scenes. And so they're first drawn by artists. Most of the names that we hypothetically associate with the execution of the mosaics, there's no document that tells us so-and-so did such and such, but the names are those of contemporary painters. The mosaics seem to reflect their style, and that would make sense. What the painter had drawn, indicating the colors he wanted, then had to be executed in mosaic. And that means that, as with fresco, to the actual masonry surface, in this case, an inclined surface of the dome, they have to apply a stratum of plaster into which they probably did something like a synopia. They did an outline of what they're going to do, and then the actual mosaic masters put the little pieces called tesserae in place if a figure was to have a red robe, that area would be indicated in red, and they'd put in red tesserae. If the red robe had a gold border, they'd put in gold, and so on. Where you were meant to see the background, they put in transparent glass tesserae mounted on pure gold leaf. The beauty of this kind of Byzantine-style mosaic is also in its sheer splendor, and its impact on people was related to what everyone understood to be its staggering cost. But that process, with a team of skilled workmen, still took its time. We assume that at full speed in the 13th century. At given moments, there may have been as many as 4 or 5 artists working on different parts of the dome, each with a team of several assistants. And so the century-long period in which the mosaics seem to have been executed, while it seems very long to us, actually is fairly good and efficient work for the period. I hope that helps you understand the process.
Thank you. Fascinating. Is there another one in the room? Because there's another one on the chat. We'll go to the chat. Graham Wright says, when was the facade of the Duomo finished?
The facade of the Duomo begun with the building itself in 1296. The facade designed by Arnolfo di Cambio was never finished. After his death, others carried it a little further forward. It rose to about 1/3 of the intended height. The niches were not all filled with statues. They interrupted initial work on decorating the facade because they had to finish building the structure, the cathedral. When they finally had done most of that and turned again to the task of decorating the facade, so much time had passed and the style of Florentine art had changed so radically that they didn't quite know how to continue what had been begun in the earlier period. And so, as I say to Italian school children who come to the museum, they did something that our modern politicians often do when they're not perfectly certain of the right course to take. They did nothing for about 2 centuries. Finally, the unfinished medieval facade in 1587 was removed at the order of Grand Duke Francis I, who wanted to proceed immediately with a modern facade, of which we have the beautiful wood model in the museum. But he died in that year. His brother, former Cardinal Grand Duke Ferdinand, did not like that design, had other designs made. None of them ever got built. And so it got a facade again only in the late 17th century, when on the occasion of the marriage of the eldest son and heir of Grand Duke Cosimo III, Gran Principe Ferdinando, in 1682 or 8, now I get confused, to a Bavarian princess, Violante di Baviera. They decided not to do what they'd done up to that point, which was to put up stage scenery in front of the bare cathedral front, but rather to call stage painters from Bologna to paint a false facade on the cathedral. And that was done. We have engravings of what it looked like. And the earliest photographs of the cathedral in the 1850s and 60s show the very faded remains of this painted classical-looking facade, which people had come to dislike, in part because it had the Medici arms on it, and Italy was moving toward its Risorgimento and its redefinition as a state. So they wanted to get rid of all of that Baroque and monarchical stuff on the facade. And as you know, in Italy, as in England, they felt that the period of great national identity had been the Middle Ages. And so, like the Houses of Parliament in London, so the cathedral facade in Florence had to be Gothic. And so we get that style that I call railroad Gothic. It has the complexity and chargé surabondance of 19th century machinery. But that was finished in the late 1880s, unfortunately. No, it could have been much worse. We have the other projects.
Well, there you go. That's a very honest answer. Before we go on with the questions, I'm just going to come on camera for a moment, if I may, Timothy. I'll put in my weekly reminder to our Zoomers that if you're ready and feel willing, any contributions you might like to make will be gratefully received. And Sarah will put up the link. People in the room will have to pay to get in. Zoomers have free access, but we do like it when you show your appreciation to help us keep the program going. Thank you. So there's plenty more on the comments, but I want people in the room to have a chance. Michael wants to say something.
Timothy, do we know when and why Florence chose John the Baptist as its patron saint? Is there any history behind that, any knowledge of how it came about?
Exactly how it came about is uncertain. Why it came about is clear, at least by inference, because the period when this happens, between the 11th and 12th century, is a period when a number of the emerging important Italian city-states are seeking to enhance their own prestige by claiming as heavenly patrons important personages. The Venetians had robbed the body of St. Mark, and after the 12th Crusade, richly decorate the facade of St. Mark's Basilica with the handsome marble columns and capitals, which were part of the booty from the sack of Constantinople. And they're doing that because they're promoting themselves. Florence opted for St. John the Baptist, whom they even put on the unit of currency, so that the saint who preached austere poverty and renunciation becomes a symbol of Florentine wealth on the gold coins. But it's part of a process that we see elsewhere in Europe of upping the ante. I mean, many of these cities had rather less well-known saints in earlier periods. In Florence, there was Saint Zenobius and Santa Reparata, but who's ever really heard of them? Really, by the late Middle Ages, people didn't even know Reparata's name anymore. They called her Santa Liberata, and associated that her patronage with an early event in the history of the liberation of Florence from its enemies. So John the Baptist was a good choice. Exactly how that came about is not entirely clear. They did acquire relics of John the Baptist, but it doesn't start with the relics. It starts before they get the relics. They get the relics because they've decided this is the place of John the Baptist. There, you're welcome.
Next one from Zoom on a comment. Penny Kobe asks, were any special measures undertaken to protect the baptistry during the Second World War?
Yes. The doors were completely encased in sandbag containing structures. You couldn't see them. There were these massive structures in front of each of the doors. The statues above the doors, I believe, were removed, as were the statues from the bell tower that are now in the museum. What you see on the bell tower are copies. So efforts were made to protect the masterpieces in the event of bombardment. Obviously, the building itself you couldn't remove, you couldn't entirely cover. In fact, effort was made by the Allied forces to not destroy the historic center of these cities, which didn't interest the Allies militarily. Bombs were dropped on Florence, but they were dropped on the outlying regions where you had the principal rail connections. The Allies wanted to block rail traffic, which transported arms and men within fascist Italy. So Florence was fortunate, and most of the Italian cities came out very well with their monuments preserved. There are obvious and tragic exceptions, Monte Cassino and some of the Roman buildings, but Florence came out without any major destruction of the historic structures.
Okay, room turn. Anyone in the room? Yes, we got one here.
I was just wondering, from like a Catholic Christian historical perspective, is the original baptismal considered the most important thing there? Because I think about like Assisi and I kind of liken it to that, which has been built up around where St. Francis is buried. So
The original
is the original
baptistry.
from a Catholic and Christian perspective, is that,
Well,
because it's all beautiful, but from a Catholic perspective, what's the importance?
the Catholic Church has continually changed and modernized its monuments. Rome is the best example. But as I said, an effort was made, very unusually, to preserve the space of the original, probably late 4th, early 5th century baptistry. That space became the enclosed area around the font in the new baptistry. So one of the things that the Florentine 14th century historian Giovanni Villani says is that not only was the baptistry never destroyed, so the building we see, according to him, is the original ancient Roman temple, but it's always been there. He insists on that. It's always been there. Now, he could not have known that the building that he saw was the fruit of fairly recent construction and decoration. And so his legitimation seems to be the knowledge that must have been passed down that notwithstanding all of the superficial changes that had been made in the building, they had carefully preserved the original space where Florentines had been baptized since early Christian times. That fact is impressive because there are relatively few places that managed to at least symbolically preserve a memory of early liturgical practice in that way. But the original building was understood to be totally inadequate to the needs of the city. They didn't see these things primarily as historical monuments, but as functional buildings. They baptized only a few times a year, and so they needed a large space to hold the great numbers of people who would bring children to be baptized. And so that the small original baptistry was simply impossible. Also, the beginning of the building of the baptistry that we know, which we think happened, I said, in 1059, happened during the period when the church in Florence was ruled by a bishop, Geoffrey of Burgundy, Frenchman. No one is perfect. Who in those years was elected Pope, Nicholas II. And he seems to have launched a rebuilding program that was meant to enlarge and modernize all of the principal early Christian churches. Now, he would have done that, obviously he remained Bishop of Florence as well as Pope. He would have done that in part because the city was growing and they needed larger churches, but also as a way of expressing an eternal newness within the life of the church that ancient buildings not only restored, but given an entirely new hold on life have always expressed. You think of what was done in 17th century Rome, where an early Christian basilica like St. John Lateran is completely modernized. If you go into St. John Lateran, behind those massive Baroque pilasters, if you bring your hammer and pick with you, you can find the early Christian columns. They're still there, but they saw no problem in doing that. That was really part of an eternal capacity for renewal that the church has. Does that answer your question a bit?
Following on from that, from Grace on the Zoom, is the baptistry still used for baptism?
It is indeed. We have baptisms once a month in the baptistry. Since the cathedral is no longer a parish, we don't have our own families, but many Florentine families want their children buried in the baptistry, in part because down the centuries, many families have continued to be baptized in the baptistry, that brought their children, and so they want the child, the grandchild to be baptized there. They have to get permission from their parish priest, and then put themselves on the list, because doing only one Sunday a month baptisms, we can't do more than about 5, most 6 people, because the babies unfortunately do not come alone. They bring numbers of family members, and so to avoid crowds, we do a limited number. So you might have to wait a bit, but almost everyone gets baptized before death.
That's good to hear. And are suitable donations made for the privilege?
There's no set fee. Normally for sacramental services in the church, people leave an offering, but they're not. That's not asked for in any sense. If they want to, wonderful. If they don't want to, no one says, "Why didn't you leave an offering?"
Tourists pay, but not the residents.
Well, tourists pay to see the building illuminated expensively as a masterpiece of architecture.
Okay.
When the baptisms are given, the lights are turned off.
Perfect. Okay. Anyone else in the room want to have a go? Yeah, we got one over here.
Is the black and white stone apocryphal, or did they actually do that?
I didn't get the question.
Using the black stone for a boy and the white stone for a girl?
That's I think that's apocryphal.
Is that apocryphal?
I know of no reason to think it's true.
Up on the Zoom, Karen Thompson has been waiting patiently to ask, do we know where the tesserae for the mosaics were made? And will an analysis of the glass be part of the conservation work?
Certainly, some the forms of possible analysis of all the materials are part of any serious restoration project today. Our assumption is that they're made in Florence. I mean, today you could go online and order up a few hundred pounds of tesserae from wherever in the world, from Beijing or Shenzhen or what have you. In the Middle Ages, if it wasn't available locally, it wasn't available. And so while we know that at the beginning of the process, they had to bring in artisans probably from Venice to teach Florentine artists how to do mosaics, because it wasn't a practiced art here in Florence, they soon learned, and the assumption has always been that the tesserae are made in Florence.
We've got one more on the Zoom, and end up with the end of the Zoom, and we'll allow one more from the room if people are desperate, maybe even 2, but we'll do the Zoom one first. Was any of the demolished ducal palace, I think that's probably Bishop's Palace, wasn't it, preserved? Was any of the demolished palace preserved and indeed displayed?
Yes, the windows, 1 or 2 of the handsome Gothic windows that were discovered beneath the 16th century siding, as it were, the modernization of the palace in the late 16th century had concealed the medieval structure, but in demolishing it, they found, as I said, some of the medieval remnants. And in the courtyard of what today is the Archbishop's Palace, which was the office building right behind the old palace, we have this handsome window and a few other fragments, but not a great deal was saved.
There were a couple more here. What we'll do is we'll get you both to ask, and then Timothy can do a portmanteau answer.
One question, one of the slides you showed, you had a picture of a reconstruction of the original baptismal font.
Yes.
There in the middle of the building.
Yes.
When was that removed?
It was removed in the 16th century at the behest of Grand Duke Francis I. And the whole way in which people brought children to baptism was changing. They were beginning to be baptismal fonts in other churches. And the Medici Grand Duke wanted the center of the baptistry, where the font and that enclosure around it really occupied all the space. He wanted the center of the baptistry to be available for other occasions. What other occasions? One of the functions of important churches, not only in Florence, elsewhere in the past, was that of funerals and even what we would call proxy funerals. That is to say, a prince to whom the local ruling house is related or with whom it has good relations dies. You learn of this a few weeks later when messages bring you. You stage a kind of proxy funeral, which meant building what in French is called a chapelle ardente at the center where you'd expect to have the corpse in a coffin. You build this great structure, many levels, on which you put candles and the whole thing blazes with light. And you decorate the building with funereal black cloth, and sometimes, as they did at San Lorenzo, with rather macabre, we're approaching Halloween, enormous skeletons and so on. But this was one of the forms of religious theater, very popular, and the Grand Duke wanted the baptistry too to be available for this. And I think the specific occasion was a funeral. Now I forget whose funeral, but certainly someone who was dead. And it's decided to remove. In part, this involved a kind of contempt for the work of art that occupied the center of the baptistry, which we consider a masterpiece of the Tuscan Romanesque marble inlay art. But the 16th century didn't like that. It was wretched medieval stuff. In fact, many pieces of the baptismal font were sold off to rural churches and wound up in unlikely situations in barns and so on. Now they're all in museums somewhere, but it was not carefully preserved as a masterpiece. We have many pieces of it, but they were simply, along with innumerable other marble fragments, in the warehouse of the Opera del Duomo. One of our pieces of the font was used in the 15th century to make another kind of work. They simply turned the beautiful marble inlay of the side that you were meant to see to the wall, and on the back they incised a Renaissance kind of perspective and architecture to make a Eucharistic tabernacle, and they cut out the door necessary for the tabernacle in the center, and they put a little metal door. It's in the museum. You can, it's on a hinge, so you can see the original side with this strange metal door cut into it, and then you can turn the work on the hinge and see the back with the 15th century tabernacle cut into the backside of it. So it was not understood to be an important example of Tuscan Romanesque craftsmanship until I'd say the late 19th, 20th century.
Last question from the room.
Okay, thank you. Who's going to carry out the restorations of the mosaics? Because for the marble, you have that wonderful in-house studio, but obviously this is a bit different.
Well, the direction of the work is shared by the Opera del Duomo, which does have its own team of restorers, and the Opificio. So we seek advice and guidance from them. They suggest the additional restorers that we need. Our own people are neither specialized in mosaic restoration or numerous enough to do this, but it's a kind of, as most of our big restorations are, shared effort with the Opificio. The opera bears the cost of it. It doesn't come from anywhere else, but the actual direction of the work is in the hands of the opera, guided by the Opificio, and is done by specialists. I can't tell you exactly who is on the team, but that's the pattern that we use always.
Well, thank you very much. There's just a couple more comments on the chat. Actually set up the end piece very well. Virginia, I think it was, it's now disappeared, made reference to how impressive the Museo della Opera del Duomo is. And if you don't know it, I strongly urge you make a visit, because it's Monsieur Timothy's great lavoro to create a fantastic new a structure in the old palazzo to show off the extraordinary treasures there. So that really is worth a visit. And then last of all, from Christina Mifsud, who's coming across as someone very influenced by you early in her life and a bit of a super fan, I think. And she says in wonderful Italian inglese, Padre Verdon, lei è informissimo, o Algoroni. And I think as a tribute from somebody who sat at your feet early on and was delighted to be reconnecting with you, I think she said it all for all of us. So thank you very much for a really fabulous lecture.
Thank you.
From all part of all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zoomers, and we'll see you all next week for Matteo Sansone's lecture on madness at the opera. And for those who are in the room, we now retire for our customary glass of wine from our current wine partners, the Tenuta degli Dei, who have got serving particularly good Chianti varietals at the moment. So in the other room, you'll get your wine.